Before you relax and drift into this story, I just want to ask you one thing. If you enjoy my voice and the story itself, please let me know in the comments. It really means a lot to me.
Imagine stepping into a bustling ancient city at dawn. The sun is barely up, the streets are still cool with the fading touch of night, and yet, your nostrils recoil. Something is wrong. Something is deeply wrong. The air is thick, not with mist, but with a stench so layered and complex that your mind struggles to name it. It's not one smell. It's a symphony of rot, waste, sweat, burning fat, stagnant water, and something else, something alive, or recently dead. And it clings to you. That smell? It was daily life. We romanticize the ancient world. We think of marble temples, golden mosaics, silk-draped banquets, philosophers walking under olive trees. But if we were truly transported there, most of us wouldn't marvel. We'd gag. The first, inescapable truth about ancient cities is this: they stank. They stank constantly, overwhelmingly, and unimaginably. But what exactly did they smell like? And more importantly, what stank the most? To answer that, we have to walk through these cities as they truly were. Not as ruins, not as museum reconstructions, but as breathing, sweating, filthy organisms. Every ancient city was alive, and every living thing decays. Let's begin with one of the oldest, Uruk, cradle of civilization. At its height, it was home to perhaps 40,000 people, a metropolis by ancient standards. It had no sewer system. Human waste was tossed into the streets or into canals. Those same canals were used to draw water. The air near them shimmered with flies. Excrement piled into corners. Dogs scavenged. Rats nested. And the heat of Mesopotamia did the rest. Imagine it. The concentrated scent of tens of thousands relieving themselves into open gutters, fermenting under the sun, day after day. But the human nose adapts. If you lived there, you might stop noticing, unless something new wafted in. Something worse. Rotting meat. Markets were everywhere, filled with slaughtered animals, piles of fish, baskets of fruit. Meat was cut in the open. There was no refrigeration. Blood soaked into wooden stalls and dried in the cracks. Internal organs were dumped nearby. By afternoon, the sun would bake the scene into a stomach-churning reek. And if a carcass wasn't fresh, it didn't go to waste. It was still sold, cheaper, of course. In Rome, things got grander. The eternal city, they called it. And it certainly felt eternal if you stood too close to the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer. This engineering marvel drained the city's waste into the Tiber River. But here's the twist. The Tiber was also the city's primary water source. People bathed in it, washed clothes in it, and drank from it. The stench of the riverbank in high summer must have been unforgettable. But it wasn't just the water. Public toilets in Rome weren't private stalls. They were long marble benches with holes, side by side, in the open. Underneath, a slow-moving stream carried waste away, if the water was flowing. If not, it pooled. People wiped themselves with shared sponges dipped in vinegar, then left them there, reused. The sponge bucket alone may have been the most wretchedly revolting detail in a city of 1 million. Now imagine walking through a Roman street. You pass a bakery, warm bread, comforting. Then next door, a tannery. And that's when it hits. Tanning leather was among the most putrid trades in antiquity. Animal hides were soaked in urine to loosen the hair. Then in a mixture of water and feces, sometimes human, often dog, to soften them. The resulting stench could travel for blocks. It was so bad that tanneries were pushed to the edge of cities, but wind didn't care about zoning laws. If it blew the wrong way, everyone knew. Urine, by the way, was a prized commodity. It was collected in jars placed along streets for public urination. Why? Because it contained ammonia, perfect for cleaning clothes. Fullers, those who cleaned wool, would stomp garments in vats of stale urine, churning the cloth with their feet. The combination of hot fabric, body sweat, and ammonia was a signature scent of Roman laundries. But the Romans didn't invent stink. Travel east to Mohenjo-Daro, in the Indus Valley. Their civilization was astonishingly advanced. with actual drains and latrines. But they still struggled with waste. Organic matter clogged the pipes. Mosquitoes nested in standing water. And the monsoon rains would flood everything, bringing refuse to the surface, mixing it with soil, turning streets into open cesspools. Now let's go to Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the city of Plato and Socrates. And yet, one of its greatest challenges? Garbage. There were no garbage men. Citizens were expected to carry their trash outside the city walls. Many didn't, so it piled up. Rotten food, broken pottery, animal bones, menstrual rags, and worse, all left to decay in alleys. Slaves may have done the carrying, or not. Either way, the aroma of Athens wasn't philosophical. But the worst smell of all, worse than excrement, worse than urine, worse than fish heads, was death. Cities had people, and people died. Constantly, epidemics swept through without warning. During the plague of Athens, corpses filled the streets. So many died so quickly that burial rites were abandoned. Bodies were tossed into mass graves or burned in heaps. In one terrifying account, families fought over funeral pyres, shoving each other's dead aside to make room. The smoke from these fires, thick, oily, human, blanketed the city. Disease has a smell: rotting lungs, ruptured flesh, boils. And when death comes in numbers, it overwhelms the senses. In medieval cities, things got worse before they got better. London, Paris, Florence, they all stank. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Butchers tossed offal into the gutters. Horses filled the roads with dung. In summer, everything fermented. In winter, it froze, then thawed. The Thames became a ribbon of filth. The Seine, a poisoned artery. But here's the strangest part. People didn't think it was strange. The idea of smell equals danger hadn't formed yet. The dominant belief for centuries was that disease came from bad air, miasma. But no one knew the real culprits. Bacteria, viruses, parasites. They washed less, not more. Perfume masked filth. And they walked through it daily. There are recorded accounts of people fainting from the smell of certain neighborhoods. Visitors wrote of cities where the stench hit miles away. Diplomats complained, but they came anyway, because the cities thrived. Trade, politics, invention, they all flourished despite the filth. And that's where the contradiction lies. The very things that made ancient cities vibrant, population density, open markets, communal spaces, also made them unbearably smelly. But no one lived alone. Smell was a shared experience, a cultural backdrop, a reality of flesh and function. Still, some places were worse than others. The tanneries of Fez, Morocco, the fish markets of Alexandria, the corpse-filled trenches of Plague-era Marseille, the back alleys of Edo in Japan, where night soil was collected in buckets and sold as fertilizer, the pits beneath castles where waste accumulated for generations. We'll never truly know the worst smell. Smell doesn't fossilize, but we can reconstruct it, piece by piece. And in doing so, we get closer to understanding not just how ancient people lived, but what they endured. The stench of ancient cities wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the system. Cities were machines of consumption and waste, always growing, always discarding. Every breath taken in a city came with the breath of its decay. But here's something even more fascinating. To survive in such places, people developed an intimate relationship with smell. They could tell time, danger, even morality by scent. In ancient Egypt, the city of Thebes shimmered in the desert sun. Monumental temples towered over narrow streets, and below them, the common folk lived in dense clusters. The Nile was their artery, giving life and spreading filth. In the wet season, floodwaters rose and washed animal carcasses and refuse into homes. In dry times, the sun-baked mud mixed with feces into a crusty, dusty vapor that clung to skin. But Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness. They bathed daily when possible. They shaved body hair. They perfumed themselves with myrrh, frankincense, and lotus oil. Not just for pleasure, for survival. Smelling good was moral. Smelling bad was sinful. Priests purified themselves before entering temples not only ritually but olfactorily. To approach the gods while stinking was unthinkable. Yet, just outside temple walls, the tanner boiled cow hides in pits of sour urine. The divide between sacred scent and civic stink was sharp. The same society that embalmed its dead with perfumed oils let its living suffer the sour soup of street waste and open markets. It wasn't just bodily waste or death that poisoned the air. Take Athens again during a siege. Starvation changes everything. People eat what they can. Dogs, rats, leather, eventually each other. The human body, when wasting away, emits ketones, a sweet, sickly scent. Add to that infected wounds, open sores, diarrhea. Now imagine that multiplied by thousands. Inside stone walls, with nowhere to run. Cities under siege became pressure cookers of smell. Foul air was the first sign that something was wrong inside. It was a weapon, too. In some wars, rotting animal corpses were catapulted over walls. A form of psychological warfare and biological. The stench broke morale. Spread disease. Announced doom before a single sword was drawn. But smell didn't just signal filth. It meant money. In ancient China, the capital of Chang'an teemed with over 1 million souls. Its marketplaces were vibrant and pungent. Vendors fried fish in rancid oil. Butchers hacked through bone and fat. Medicinal stalls sold dried lizards, ox bile, fermented tofu. The city's wealthy citizens burned rare incense to keep the stench at bay, like an invisible wall between them and the street. They could afford to smell good. The poor? They lived nose-deep in the waste of others. Their children grew up breathing the rot of latrines and open drains. But smell was also a guide. You knew which neighbor had spoiled fish, which alley held a dead cat, which butcher watered down the blood. Scent was knowledge. In medieval Cairo, entire industries ran on rot. The Zabaline rubbish collectors scoured the streets for organic waste. They recycled bone, cloth, ash. But the worst job? The night soil men. They crept through alleys with buckets, scraping human excrement from public pits and selling it to farmers as fertilizer. Their stench was legendary. So was their pay. Because no one else would do it. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine being one of them. You're awake before dawn. You carry 2 iron buckets on a wooden pole. You walk quietly through narrow alleys, past sleeping homes. The smell of your cargo is thick, heavy, inescapable. You've stopped noticing it. But everyone else crosses the street when they see you. You are invisible and unforgettable at once. And yet, cities couldn't survive without you. The paradox of ancient cities is this: the filthiest people were often the most essential. They cleaned. They collected. They kept things moving, decaying, and regenerating. Let's travel again. To Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Aztecs. Built on water, it was crisscrossed with canals. Marketplaces buzzed with life. Unlike many old world cities, it was reportedly cleaner. They had sanitation crews. People bathed often. Waste was collected. But it still stank. Fish offal. Corn mash. Sweat. Rot. The scent of sacrifice. Temples ran red with blood. Human hearts torn out in sacred rituals. Bodies rolled down stone steps. Blood pooled, soaked, congealed. The smell of iron and death mingled with incense and flowers. A holy stink. Powerful. Fearful. Glorious. Because not all smells were reviled. Some were revered. In ancient Jerusalem, priests burned incense in the temple so much that the smoke could be seen from miles away. It wasn't just fragrance. It was divine protection. The holy smell pushed back the stink of the world. But just outside the city, in the valley of Hinnom, trash burned day and night. Fires fed by garbage and animal bones, and sometimes, rumor says, more. The contrast was deliberate. Sacred air versus cursed smoke. Cities are contradictions made of stone. The same civilization that raised the Parthenon let dogs die in its gutters. The same people who created the Code of Hammurabi lived in neighborhoods with open cesspools. Smell wasn't just physical, it was cultural, spiritual, political. It was also deeply personal. A woman in ancient Rome might wear a perfume of crushed rose petals and civet, an extract from a cat-like animal's anal glands. Disgusting? Maybe. But it lingered longer. It seduced. It said, I am above the stink. I control my own scent. Control? That's the word. Because as long as cities existed, people tried to conquer their own decay. They masked it, fought it, laughed at it, feared it, but never escaped it. Even emperors could not hide. When Nero fled Rome during a particularly hot, smoggy summer, he reportedly commented on the city's stench of the people. As if he weren't one of them. As if his perfumed halls didn't sit atop the same sewer veins. But it didn't matter. His nostrils were human. They couldn't lie. No nose in history has been immune. And now neither is yours. Imagine the way smell could haunt a memory. In ancient times, the scent of a street could remain with someone for life. Not because it was pleasant, but because it marked a trauma. A battlefield. A famine. A fire. Smell was the first alert and the last echo. In Pompeii, moments before Mount Vesuvius buried the city in ash, life was proceeding as usual. The taverns were open. The brothels were crowded. Food was cooking. But even before the eruption, the city stank. Sulfur from the nearby volcanic vents blended with sewage-filled streets and the grease of fried fish. Visitors often described it as brutal. And yet people lived, loved, and laughed in it until the air itself turned deadly. Sulfur and ash rained down. Then came the burning gas, rolling like a wall. And what did it smell like in those final seconds? Hot stone, charred flesh, acid and fire. The nose would have been overwhelmed before the lungs collapsed. But for those who found the bodies centuries later, the scent of death was long gone, only the silence remained. Contrast that with ancient marketplaces, full of noise, color, and unimaginable odor. A mix so potent that your stomach would rebel and your curiosity would pull you forward at the same time. Let's walk into one. The meat is displayed openly. Flies dance like dust motes. A man saws a goat's head in half. Steam rises from cooked tripe. Nearby, a woman sells fermented fish paste. Her hands are coated in it. She eats with those hands. Laughs. Shouts prices. A barrel of pickled onions nearby bursts from heat, leaking brine into the street. Children run past, barefoot, stepping in blood, mud, and worse. There is no escape from the smell. Only layers. Further down, incense burns not for sale, but to mask what's beyond. A tannery. Ranks of vats filled with lime, dung, and urine. Men wade in, bare-legged, up to their knees. Their feet are pale and puckered. The hides float like drowned animals. The smell is indescribable. Animal. Human. Chemical. And it never leaves. You could wash your hands 100 times and still feel it clinging. That's what ancient stench was, persistence. A ghost that followed you from sunrise to sleep. It's easy to imagine that we, modern people, would never survive it. That we're too sensitive, too clean. But ancient noses were no different from ours. They simply adjusted. And sometimes they suffered. Historical records speak of people vomiting from smells. Of fevers triggered by foul air. Of citizens begging for relief from putrid neighbors. Yet in all of this, no one stopped building cities. Because the benefits outweighed the stink. Cities meant trade, protection, opportunity, connection. And even the smell of rot was a kind of connection. Everyone was in it together. Rich or poor, merchant or slave. The air was shared. Still, the wealthy tried to rise above it literally. In cities like Constantinople, the elite lived uphill. Wind direction mattered. So did elevation. The lower quarters, by the docks and sewers, were for the masses. The smell of fish, tar, salt, and excrement swirled there endlessly. But higher up, perfume. Spices. Flowers. The sweet air of privilege. It wasn't just geography. It was architecture. Some villas had indoor fountains, not for beauty, but to fill rooms with the smell of clean water. Others burned cedar or sandalwood. And some had slaves who waved palm fronds soaked in rose oil simply to keep the air moving. But even emperors couldn't seal themselves completely. When disease came, it didn't knock. Plague swept into cities with rats and fleas. And long before the fever started, people said they could smell it. A sweetness. A wrongness. The air turned heavy. Streets grew quiet. Then came the carts. The bodies. The fires. The mass graves. In Florence, during the Black Death, survivors reported that the stink of corpses filled every corner. No perfume could hide it. And priests said it was the smell of sin. God's punishment made olfactory. Yet some found profit. Perfume makers sold plague waters. Herbal blends to wear or drink. Charcoal masks. Pomanders, small balls filled with clove, cinnamon, and ambergris were worn on chains kept close to the nose. Anything to block out the world. And still, it seeped in. Even monasteries, isolated and clean, suffered. Not just from waste or plague, but from the simple rot of time. Books molded. Cellars soured. Candles smoked. And human beings, no matter how devout, still sweated. Still died. Still smelled. We often imagine history in silence and dust. But if you could close your eyes and stand in an ancient city, you'd hear shouting, clanging, singing, and you'd smell everything. Life didn't just happen, it fermented. Even the food contributed. In ancient India, garlands of onions, garlic, and spiced meats were sold in street stalls. Delicious, but days later, the remnants clogged drains and fed rats. In northern Europe, cabbage stewed endlessly. The scent of boiled cabbage, ale, and latrine waste? That was the smell of home. Sometimes even joy stank. Weddings meant feasts, which meant leftovers. And leftovers attracted dogs, pigs, maggots. Festivals meant fire, sweat, spilled wine, and crowded bodies. 1,000 people celebrating in summer heat turned the city center into a sauna of musk and smoke. And yet, despite all the stink, people found beauty. They carved poems, painted frescoes, fell in love, all while holding their breath through a cloud of decay. Because the ancient world wasn't clean, but it was alive. Let's dive into another layer, the smell of religion. In the sacred cities of India, the scent of devotion was everywhere. Varanasi, perched on the banks of the Ganges, has seen thousands of years of continuous worship. Pilgrims arrive daily to bathe in the holy river, to burn their dead, to chant under the rising sun. The river's water, thick with ash, flowers, and remains, holds a smell that's both sacred and unsettling. Burning bodies have a distinct odor. It clings to fabric, skin, even memory. But in Varanasi, it's not taboo. It's part of the cycle. Life, death, and decay all exist openly, fragranced with sandalwood, marigold, and the heat of cremation fires. To outsiders, it might be overwhelming. To locals, it's the breath of the divine. Religious rituals in many cultures used smell as a way to access the supernatural. Incense wasn't just pleasant, it was a key. In ancient Mesopotamia, burning cedar and juniper was believed to summon the gods. In Catholic Europe, the rising smoke of frankincense during Mass wasn't symbolic, it was practical. It masked the reek of unwashed crowds. But it also lifted the spirit, made the invisible feel closer. Because smell is emotion. Immediate. Inescapable. Which is why ancient punishment often involved smell. In Rome, criminals might be forced to clean sewers or be thrown into the cloaca maxima, the massive drainage system. The smell alone was said to drive men mad. In some medieval prisons, small cells were located directly beneath latrines. A slow, suffocating torture, not of violence, but of exposure. Smell became judgment. If a place stank, it was cursed. If a person stank, they were dirty, sinful, unworthy. Inquisitors even recorded the odors of suspected witches. Sour breath, oily skin, the scent of rot, as if damnation had a perfume. But let's not forget the practical minds of the ancients. In many cities, solutions were attempted. Some Greek cities had basic sewage systems. The Indus Valley Civilization built advanced drains and toilets over 4,000 years ago. In Islamic cities during the Golden Age, public bathhouses became social hubs designed not just for hygiene, but for community. Scented soaps, flowing water, conversations echoed through marble halls. A break from the filth outside, but none of it lasted forever. Infrastructure crumbles. Pipes clog. Systems fail. And even in places of innovation, the air grew heavy again. And what about love? In every age, people fell for each other, desired each other. But how did they manage it surrounded by so much stink? The answer is simple, the nose adapted. People fell in love with the scent of another person, not despite the sweat and grime, but through it. In medieval Paris, lovers exchanged pieces of clothing infused with their personal scent. A scarf worn for days. A glove kissed and sent away. It wasn't a perfume. It was proof. Intimacy by odor. And yes, perfumes helped. But many of them were built on strange ingredients. Ambergris, a waxy substance from whale intestines. Musk, scraped from the glands of deer. Civet, again from cats. These were prized because they stuck to the skin, survived the day, masked the city. They were expensive, exotic, desired, and ultimately they were a way of pretending. Pretending the city wasn't rotting, pretending the streets didn't overflow, pretending that beneath silk robes and marble columns there wasn't a core of composting flesh and refuse. But the nose never lies. Even in beauty, there was always decay. Let's return for a moment to a Roman banquet. The table is lavish. Olives, honey dormice, garum fermented fish sauce drips onto roasted meats. The guests laugh, drink wine, flirt. And all the while, behind the kitchen door, slaves clean out chamber pots. The smell wafts through occasionally. No one comments. They've accepted it. But in the quiet of night, as the candles burn low, that stink becomes louder. The wine turns sour in the mouth. The perfume fades. What remains is the truth. That the city, for all its glory, is dying in slow motion. Every ancient city was like this. A living body, built of stone and flesh, always decaying from within. But what did people do? They lit candles, burned herbs, kissed in dark corners, laughed despite it all. Because humans are stubborn. They will build palaces next to sewage pits. They will eat feasts with flies circling. They will compose poetry in the middle of a plague. And they will call it civilization. That contradiction, filth and beauty, stink and splendor, is what defines us. And the cities? They remember. They hold the layers of scent in their soil. Archaeologists may dig up bones and pottery, but they also find residues, burn marks, traces of oil, microscopic filth, a shadow of the old stench. Sometimes when tombs are opened, the smell still escapes. Sealed for thousands of years, it emerges like a ghost. Not imagined. Real. The final breath of a lost world. And we wrinkle our noses even now, as if we're better, cleaner, safer. Are we? We still generate mountains of waste. Our cities are sprayed with chemicals, not incense. Our perfumes hide industrial air, not animal rot. But the core remains. Human life is messy. The scent of living is unavoidable. Maybe that's why we bury it. We mask. We scrub. We sanitize. Because if we smell the truth too clearly, we might remember what we are. Imagine the streets after a festival. The lights have dimmed. The musicians are gone. The torches are out. But the air is thick. Rancid wine, crushed fruit, animal dung, blood from sacrificial altars, human sweat, and the faint smoke of 100 burned offerings still hang in the windless dark. You walk through it. Your sandals stick to the ground. Something squelches. The celebration is over, but the stench has just begun. This was the cycle in ancient cities. The smell of joy turned quickly into the smell of decomposition. And in some places, the party never ended. Markets stayed open year-round. Food spoiled daily. Animals lived, bred, and died in the same stalls. The scent didn't change, it deepened. And so the ancient city became a living compost heap. Not metaphorically. Literally. The layers of organic matter piled up garbage, waste, fish heads, rotten vegetables, straw soaked in urine. The ground was uneven because the city was, in part, sitting on itself. Rot built on rot. And with each season, the smell thickened. And yet, people continued to build upwards. In ancient Rome, the street level we walk on today is not the one people used 2,000 years ago. The ancient street is often buried meters below, sealed under centuries of filth, stone, fire, and rebuild. If you were to dig into the earth beneath the Colosseum, you wouldn't just find relics, you'd find a history of smell compacted into dust. Even medieval cities grew in this way. Layers upon layers. Mud brick over manure, timber over rot. It was cheaper to build over a problem than to clean it. And that made every step a descent into sensory overload. Now imagine this. You're a traveler new to a city. You enter the gates just before dusk. The sun is low. The smell hits you like a wave. Not from one direction, but from everywhere. It wraps around your face, your clothes. You try to breathe through your mouth, but taste follows scent. Your tongue recoils. And then a man selling skewered meat offers you dinner. Do you trust it? Because here's another truth, even the food smelled like the city. Smoke from dung-fueled fires clung to bread. The water, often drawn from contaminated wells or aqueducts, tasted faintly of metal and algae. Wine masked more than thirst, it masked rot. But they drank it. They had no choice. And in that survival, another odor rose, the smell of bodies. We often forget that most people did not bathe regularly. In fact, many thought it dangerous. Roman public baths were widespread, but not always trusted. In the Middle Ages, after the fall of the empire, bathing became rarer. Some believed that water opened the skin to illness. Better to stay dry and stink than risk infection. The result? A mingling of natural scent, sweat, breath, old clothes, shoes never cleaned, teeth never brushed. In crowds, it became overpowering. Churches, markets, taverns. Anywhere people gathered, the smell became part of the space. You didn't notice it unless you left and returned. Like how your own room smells strange only when you walk in after a long trip. The body itself became an ecosystem of odor. And some people were proud of it. Musk was attractive. Sweat was proof of labor. Scars and grime told stories. But sometimes it wasn't just human. In many cities, the dead weren't immediately buried. They were wrapped, stacked, or kept in ossuaries. During plagues or war, entire districts became makeshift cemeteries. The smell of death was constant. Not dramatic, just ever-present. Like mold. Like wet earth. Like something not quite living. And still, cities thrived. Because smell wasn't the only thing in the air. So was ambition. Rome reeked, but it ruled the known world. Alexandria sweltered, but it held the greatest library in history. Athens stank, but it birthed democracy. Civilization and sanitation rarely marched in step. And that's where the paradox lies. The more people you gather, the more filth you produce. But the more people you gather, the greater your ideas become. Cities were filthy because they were full of life. And life is dirty. This didn't go unnoticed by the thinkers of the time. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, believed that air quality affected health. He advised that cities be built with wind patterns in mind. not for beauty, but for breath, to prevent the air from turning toxic, to let the stink escape. Later, in Islamic cities, this evolved into science. Urban planning included airflow, waste systems, clean wells, shaded walkways. Mosques were perfumed with rose water. Streets swept daily. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Cleanliness became divine. But that idea took centuries to spread. In most places, even as kingdoms rose and fell, the stink remained the same. It simply wore a new crown. When the Mongols swept across Eurasia, they carried not just death, but new scents. Burned horsehair, boiled meat, steppe grasses. The cities they conquered were already stinking, but the fires they left behind added smoke to the rot. And after the destruction, the rebuilding began again. New cities on top of old ruins. Fresh markets over ancient gutters. The cycle repeated. Smell, rot, fire, rebirth. Over and over. Let's now turn to a smell that terrified everyone. Disease. In ancient cities, illness had a scent. Not metaphorically, literally. The moment someone fell sick, their body changed. Fevers brought sweat. Digestive problems fouled the breath. Open sores leaked fluids. And when entire populations got sick, the smell was unbearable. During the Black Death, the streets of European cities were lined with carts of corpses. The living piled the dead on top of one another like firewood. Houses were sealed with sick families inside. No doctors, no prayers, just rot. People said the air itself was poisoned. Miasma, they called it, bad air. They believed that certain smells carried death. Swamps, sewers, dead animals, unwashed bodies. They weren't wrong about the link between filth and disease, but they didn't understand bacteria. So they tried to fight smell with stronger smells. Plague doctors stuffed their beak-like masks with herbs, flowers, vinegar-soaked cloth. Anything to block the stench. Rich families burned incense day and night. Even poor people clutched garlic or lavender to their noses, desperate for a breath of something clean. But you can't escape the truth. When thousands die, the city becomes a morgue. The streets run dark. The cellars fill. The soil rejects more bodies. And the smell? It rolls through alleyways like fog. It sticks to walls. Settles into lungs. That scent, the perfume of apocalypse, was unforgettable. And it wasn't rare. There were other plagues, other horrors. In Constantinople, the plague of Justinian ravaged the city for decades. Eyewitnesses described corpses in fountains, a silence broken only by the buzz of flies. The emperor tried to cleanse the city, but even his gold couldn't silence the smell of death. And yet, life continued, because what else could people do? There was no pause button, no escape. You still had to eat, trade, marry, pray. So people adapted. In ancient Egypt, perfume became armor. The wealthy wore scented cones on their heads, wax blocks infused with myrrh and lotus. As the day wore on, the cone melted, releasing fragrance into the heat. A portable, oily shield against the city's filth. In Greece, scented oils were a social necessity. Athletes at the gymnasium oiled their bodies, scraped off sweat and dirt with strigils, then perfumed again. It was ritual, yes, but also hygiene in a world without soap. In China, refined incense culture evolved into an art. Scholars burned agarwood while writing. Poets inhaled aloes wood before composing verses. Scent became a tool for thought, for clarity, for escaping the grime of the world outside. But for every refined fragrance, there were 1,000 back alleys that stank like sin. And perhaps the most persistent stench of all was power. Because power had a smell. It was in the breath of tyrants who never bathed, in the armor of soldiers crusted with blood and mud, in the robes of judges who sentenced men while flies buzzed through the courtroom, in the temples where gold gleamed but drains overflowed. Injustice had an odor. It lingered in slave quarters, where dozens slept in a single room, without fresh air, without dignity. In brothels where cheap perfume couldn't hide desperation. In prisons where wounds festered and urine pooled. The city reeked not just because of nature, but because of cruelty. And yet, again and again, humanity pushed forward. Cleanliness became aspiration. In the Renaissance, hygiene reemerged, not just as ritual but as self-respect. Doctors began to see links between filth and illness. Engineers redesigned aqueducts and waste channels. Architects designed buildings with windows, light, and airflow, simple things that had been forgotten. But it was slow. Even in 18th century Paris, chamber pots were still emptied out of windows. Even in 19th century London, the Thames was thick with sewage. Even in 20th century industrial cities, the air turned black with soot. The stink only changed shape, and our senses adapted. Because here's the most astonishing thing about ancient cities. People stopped noticing. When the stink is constant, the brain stops processing it. It becomes background, like the ticking of a clock you hear only when it stops. And that's the danger. Filth becomes invisible. You stop asking why the river smells like rot, why your neighbor coughs at night, why the walls are slimy. Because everyone is used to it. Because everyone is surviving. Until someone, an outsider, points it out. Imagine that moment. A traveler arrives. They gag at the stench. They describe your city as a cesspool. And you're offended. This is home. This is life. This is normal. But deep down, you remember what clean smells like. And you long for it. Now, picture this. A street vendor in ancient Athens, hawking fresh fish straight from the sea. The catch glistens under the hot sun, but the fish have been sitting out for hours. Flies buzz relentlessly, swarming the scales, fins, and exposed flesh. Nearby, a pile of discarded entrails and bones has started to ferment in the heat. The smell is unmistakable, sharp, acidic, and clinging like a shadow. This scene was not unusual. Fish markets in ancient cities were infamous for their overwhelming stench. In Rome, the Forum's fish vendors were notorious for leaving behind heaps of waste that attracted rats and birds, which only added to the chaos and smell. But why didn't the city authorities shut these markets down? Because they couldn't. The economies of ancient cities depended on them. Food had to be sold, and fresh fish was a prized commodity. Without refrigeration or ice, vendors worked fast, but heat always won. The stench wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sign of life's fragility. Food spoiled quickly. Water was contaminated. Every meal was a gamble. That's why many ancient recipes included copious amounts of spices and fermented sauces like garum. The Roman fish sauce made by fermenting fish guts for months in the sun. To modern noses, garum smells like rotten garbage, but to Romans it was liquid gold, essential for flavoring everything. The smell of markets was a constant reminder of the thin line between nourishment and poison. Eating in these cities was a sensory risk wrapped in deliciousness. Yet the markets were also vibrant centers of culture, gossip, and politics. The smells mingled with the sounds of shouting vendors, bartering customers, and the clatter of carts. The scent of ripe fruit and fresh bread mixed with rotting refuse in an odd harmony, creating the unique perfume of the ancient city. Moving from food to waste, let's talk about toilets. Ancient toilets were not what we imagine today. In places like Pompeii or the Indus Valley, communal latrines existed, but privacy was minimal and sanitation was primitive. Waste often drained directly into the streets or open cesspools, which overflowed regularly. The smell was unbearable. People tried to block it with aromatic herbs or by lighting fires nearby, but the effort was only partially successful. Public toilets were as much a social space as a necessity, but the smell was a constant deterrent for many. In some cultures, waste disposal was ritualized. The Romans used complex sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima to channel waste away from living spaces. But even these marvels could not fully contain the odors. In medieval Europe, cesspits under houses filled quickly, forcing residents to empty them manually, often into the streets. The resulting stench was legendary, especially in crowded urban centers where waste accumulated in corners, alleyways, and along riverbanks. One account from 14th century London describes a great stink, so powerful it drove people indoors for days. The smell wasn't just a nuisance, it was deadly. It carried diseases like cholera and typhoid. The people lived and died in this environment, trapped between survival and sanitation. So how did they cope? Some cities implemented ordinances banning the dumping of waste in streets or rivers. Others introduced rudimentary street cleaning or lime spreading to mask odors. But enforcement was difficult and ignorance widespread. And then there was the smell of animals. In these ancient Middle Eastern cities, the struggle with smell took on new dimensions. Water was scarce and the hot climate intensified every odor. Public baths and fountains offered some relief, but the refuse from the bustling markets and homes quickly overwhelmed the streets. A fascinating fact emerges here. Despite the overwhelming odors, these cities developed elaborate perfume industries. The scent of musk, amber, rose, and oud permeated the air in wealthy quarters. Perfumes weren't just luxury, they were armor against the inevitable stink of the streets. But not everyone could afford such protection. For the poor, the air was a constant assault. Trash piled in corners, open drains ran with sewage, and animals roamed freely, adding their own contributions. Latrines emptied into canals that doubled as water sources, creating a cycle of contamination and disease. Yet, even amid this filth, life thrived. Markets overflowed with color and sound, mosques echoed with prayer, and the narrow streets buzzed with commerce. One cannot ignore the psychological impact of living surrounded by such smells. Ancient scholars wrote about the connection between scent and morality, linking foul odors to sin and vice. This association wasn't just metaphorical, people truly believed bad smells could corrupt the soul. In response, rituals of purification were born. Incense burned in temples, ablutions cleansed bodies, and perfumes sanctified spaces. These practices offered a way to reclaim dignity in an environment that often felt overwhelming. Moving from the Middle East to the Far East, ancient Chinese cities presented a different relationship with odor. In the imperial courts, cleanliness was a symbol of order and power. Lavatories were carefully placed, and water systems designed to flush waste away efficiently. The use of herbal remedies, incense, and tea ceremonies was meant to elevate the senses and cleanse the spirit. However, common city streets told a different story. Waste disposal was primitive, and the sheer density of people and animals created thick clouds of smells that clung to clothes and skin. One remarkable tradition in China was the cultivation of fragrant flowers and herbs. Jasmine, chrysanthemums, and osmanthus used both in daily life and in rituals. These scents became cultural markers of refinement and balance. This contrast between elite and common experience highlights a universal theme. In ancient cities, smell was both a marker of status and survival. In bustling markets, the mingling odors of raw meat, fish, spices, sweat, and waste created a chaotic sensory mosaic. Consider the spice trade's role here. Exotic aromas from pepper, cinnamon, and cloves traveled thousands of miles to perfume the homes of the wealthy, masking the pervasive smells of the city. This olfactory layering created complex atmospheres where the foul and the fragrant coexisted. In the end, the smell of ancient cities was a mirror reflecting their contradictions: beauty and decay, power and poverty, life and death. And this duality still speaks to us today, reminding us that where there is life, there is always a smell waiting to be uncovered. Let's shift our focus now to the sewers, those hidden arteries beneath ancient cities where the real battle with smell raged in silence. The Cloaca Maxima of Rome is legendary, one of the oldest sewage systems ever built. It was engineered to drain waste and stormwater out of the city, emptying into the Tiber River. Its tunnels were marvels of engineering, but the smell inside? Absolutely suffocating. Sewers were the dark underworld of the city where toxic gases accumulated and no one willingly stayed long. The sulfurous stench of decomposing organic matter mingled with human waste created a deadly cocktail. Despite these dangers, sewers saved lives by diverting waste away from living areas. They were the invisible veins of sanitation, even if imperfect. In other cities like ancient Constantinople or medieval London, sewage often flowed openly through gutters. The open sewers invited swarms of flies and rats, breeding grounds for plague and pestilence. The smell was omnipresent, sometimes described as the breath of death. But here's a surprising detail: some cultures revered their sewer workers. In Rome, the cloacini, or sewer priests, were responsible for the sacred maintenance of the Cloaca Maxima, seeing their work as vital to the health of the city and the favor of the gods. In contrast, in medieval Europe, those who emptied cesspits or cleaned streets were outcasts, shunned despite their essential role. The smell of the sewers was a social divider, a pungent reminder of who was valued and who was discarded. And underneath it all lurked invisible killers. Gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide collected in the tunnels, sometimes exploding or poisoning those below. Tales of sewer workers falling unconscious or even dying were common. The sewers were a smelly underworld that mirrored the city's hierarchy. Above ground, the smell of smoke from hearth fires added another layer. Cooking was done indoors and outdoors, and fires burned constantly, not just for food, but for warmth and light. The smoke mixed with other city odors, adding a sharp, acrid note to the complex olfactory palate. In winter, smoke could hang in dense clouds, making the air thick and bitter. And yet, despite all the smell, rot, waste, smoke, sweat, ancient people had moments of olfactory beauty. Flower festivals, temple incense, freshly baked bread, crisp linen, herbal remedies, these scents broke through the grime and reminded inhabitants that cleanliness and fragrance were ideals worth pursuing. Smell in the ancient city was not just a physical experience, but a cultural one. It was woven into religious rituals, social status, and even politics. The stench of corruption, the perfume of power, the odor of poverty, they all told stories as vivid as any written text. So the next time you walk through a city street and catch a whiff of something unpleasant, remember, you are breathing echoes of the past. Ancient cities stank, yes, but in that stink lived the heartbeat of human civilization. As we dive deeper, consider the role of clothing in the olfactory tapestry of ancient cities. Clothes were not just fashion statements, but daily vessels for scent, both fragrant and foul. Without modern washing machines or detergents, people relied on rinsing, airing, and sometimes scrubbing with sand or ashes. But even with care, fabrics absorbed sweat, smoke, and city grime. Layers of clothing, especially wool and leather, trapped odors that clung for days or weeks. The rich could afford perfumes and scented oils to mask the stench. In Egypt, nobles anointed their linen with fragrant resins. In Rome, aristocrats doused themselves in rosewater and myrrh. The smell of someone was a social signal. Clean meant powerful, smelly meant poor or careless. But for the common folk, the smell of worn clothing was inevitable and often overwhelming. This created a sensory divide between classes. Beyond clothing, consider hair and personal hygiene. Bathing was a luxury. Public baths existed in many cities, but access was limited by cost, time, and social norms. In some cultures, regular washing was ritualized, involving oils, perfumes, and combing. In others, bathing was infrequent and the hair could harbor lice and dirt. The smell of unwashed hair was a familiar note in the city's scent symphony, earthy, pungent, sometimes sour. Yet, ancient texts also describe efforts to freshen hair with perfumes or herbal rinses, showing a universal desire to combat the stink. One striking example comes from medieval Europe, where the act of fumigation involved burning aromatic herbs or incense around one's body and clothes to cleanse the air, a primitive attempt to erase odor without water. These practices reveal the constant human struggle to balance environment, resources, and dignity. And then there's the smell of firewood and charcoal. Cooking fires burned constantly, filling homes and streets with smoke and soot. Wood smoke carried its own scent, sometimes comforting, sometimes choking. In winter months, the smoke would linger for days, mixing with fog to create a thick, choking haze. The smell was inescapable, a reminder of warmth but also of pollution. This smoke often exacerbated respiratory illnesses, compounding the dangers posed by other urban smells. Imagine breathing all these layers together: sweat, waste, smoke, animals, food, perfume, disease. The ancient city was a complex olfactory battlefield. Yet, humans adapted. The resilience to smell is a survival skill. When surrounded by constant odor, the brain filters it out to focus on more immediate threats or pleasures. But that filtering comes with a price: tolerance to what should be intolerable. We might recoil today at the idea of open sewers or garbage-strewn streets, but for ancient city dwellers, it was a normal backdrop. This acceptance shaped how cities evolved and how people lived. Some scholars argue that our ancestors' acceptance of urban stench influenced city planning, architecture, and social behavior. Courtyards, open windows, and narrow streets helped channel odors away. Public fountains and baths served as cleansing oases. Cities were living organisms adapting to the constant pressure of smell. In this way, the smellscape of ancient cities was a powerful force, shaping history in invisible but undeniable ways. Let's now explore how religion and spirituality intertwined with the smells of ancient cities. Across cultures, scent was seen as a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Incense burned in temples was not just a pleasant aroma but a symbol of purification, protection, and communication with gods. In ancient Egypt, frankincense and myrrh were prized offerings, their fragrant smoke believed to carry prayers to the heavens. Temples were filled with the thick, sweet haze, masking the less savory smells of large crowds and ritual sacrifices. In Hindu culture, incense remains a vital part of worship. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine purifies the space and the mind, creating an atmosphere conducive to meditation and prayer. But consider the paradox. These religious centers were also hubs of human activity, with crowds, animals, and waste accumulating nearby. The incense was both a spiritual offering and a practical mask. In medieval Christian Europe, church rituals included the swinging of censers releasing aromatic smoke, symbolizing the soul's ascent and divine presence. Monasteries became centers of hygiene and cleanliness, often far cleaner than surrounding cities, partly due to religious prescriptions about purity. Yet even in these sacred spaces, the stench of the city never fully disappeared. The contrast between holy fragrance and urban rot was a constant tension. Another dimension was the association of bad smells with evil or sin. The phrase "smells like sin" wasn't just metaphorical, it reflected a widespread belief that moral corruption had a scent. Witches, heretics, and criminals were often described as smelling foul, a sign of their spiritual decay. This belief influenced social dynamics, where smell became a tool of judgment and exclusion. In ancient Athens, philosophers debated the relationship between the senses and knowledge. Some argued that smell was a lowly sense tied to base instincts, while others saw it as deeply connected to memory and emotion. This ambivalence shows how complex the human relationship with odor has always been. Smell was both intimate and invasive, personal and public. In many ways, it shaped identity. The way someone smelled could mark their class, profession, and even character. Imagine the shame or pride tied to scent in these ancient worlds. And consider how this invisible marker influenced interactions: who was welcomed, who was shunned, who was feared. All of this reminds us that smell in ancient cities was more than nuisance, it was language. It communicated status, health, spirituality, and social order. And the struggle to control it shaped not just daily life but the very soul of the city. Imagine yourself walking through the bustling streets of medieval Paris. The air is thick, not just with the smell of garbage and waste, but also with the cries of merchants, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the chatter of townsfolk. But what really dominates is the oppressive stench that seems to seep into every stone and crevice. Garbage wasn't just an occasional problem, it was a constant. People threw refuse, leftover food, animal bones, broken pottery directly onto the streets or into open pits. There were no organized waste disposal systems. At night, scavengers and animals tore through the piles, scattering filth everywhere. This wasn't merely unpleasant. The rotting heaps attracted rats, which thrived in the filth and multiplied rapidly. The rats carried fleas, tiny, insidious carriers of the bubonic plague. The Great Plague of the 14th century didn't just come from nowhere. It found fertile ground in these smelly, overcrowded cities where sanitation was virtually non-existent. People didn't understand germs, but they felt the connection between filth and sickness. Attempts to clean were sporadic and often ineffective. Ordinances were passed banning waste in the streets, but enforcement was weak. The smell persisted. Some tried to combat it with lime and vinegar, substances believed to neutralize foul odors, and miasmas, the bad air thought to spread disease. But these were only small measures against a massive problem. The plague turned these stinking streets into killing fields. Families vanished overnight, entire neighborhoods emptied. And yet, the city lived on. This horror of smell and disease left a lasting mark on urban planning. Future cities learned to build wider streets, improve drainage, and regulate waste disposal, all in the name of combating the invisible enemy carried on the stench. The story of medieval cities shows us the deadly power of smell, not just as discomfort but as a vector of death. But it also shows human resilience and the slow, hard journey towards sanitation and modern urban life. It's a reminder that what we often dismiss as bad smell can have profound consequences. Turning our gaze now to ancient Rome, the city famed for its grandeur but also infamous for its overwhelming odors. Rome was a city of extremes. Marble palaces stood side by side with cramped insulae, multi-story apartment blocks housing the poor. The wealthy bathed in marble tubs perfumed with oils, while the masses shared cramped communal latrines or simply relieved themselves in the streets. The smell of urine was omnipresent. The Romans had a peculiar relationship with it. Urine was actually collected and sold as a valuable commodity used in tanning leather and laundering clothes because of its ammonia content. Public urinals and latrines were common, but sanitation was far from perfect. Waste flowed through open gutters along the streets before reaching the cloaca maxima. During festivals and public events, the stench intensified as crowds overflowed and refuse piled up. The markets, filled with fresh produce, meat, and fish, were both vibrant and pungent. Rotten fruit and spoiled meat quickly contributed to the city's characteristic smell. Even the famed Roman baths, while centers of cleanliness, sometimes gave off a mix of sweat, oils, and dirt as people crowded in. Yet Romans also understood the importance of smell in public life. Perfumes were widely used, and street vendors sold fragrant oils and incense. Writers like Juvenal used the city's smell as a symbol of moral decay, portraying Rome's stench as reflecting its corruption and decadence. But the smell of ancient Rome was more than just a metaphor, it was a physical reality shaping everyday experience. The city's aroma was a blend of life and death, pleasure and disgust. To walk its streets was to inhale the pulse of an empire at its height, filled with all its contradictions. Venturing into the ancient markets of Asia, particularly in cities like Chang'an, the Tang dynasty capital, the smells of commerce and life were just as complex and powerful. Imagine narrow alleys lined with stalls overflowing with spices, silk, teas, and exotic foods. The air here was a sensory overload, sweet, savory, sour, and yes, sometimes foul. Fish and meat markets released strong, salty odors that mixed with the fragrance of ginger, star anise, and dried citrus peels. But what stood out most was the smell of fermenting foods, soy sauce, vinegar, pickled vegetables, a scent that could be sharp and penetrating. Fermentation was essential to Asian cuisine and preservation, but produced pungent smells that city dwellers learned to live with. In these cities, sanitation was improving, with early forms of waste management and public latrines. Yet the density of population and animals meant the streets still carried a thick, mixed odor. The smell of horses, pigs, and dogs mingled with human scents, creating an organic, sometimes overwhelming atmosphere. Interestingly, Chinese medicine connected smell with health. Certain odors were believed to balance internal energies or signal illness. Temples burned incense to cleanse the air and the soul, and streets were often lined with fragrant plants to offset less pleasant smells. In this way, smell was woven into the fabric of life, health, and spirituality. Ancient Asian cities demonstrate how urban smell was not just a nuisance but an integral part of culture and survival. And as with other cities, the sensory landscape reflected broader social and environmental realities, where wealth, power, and hygiene intersected with the unavoidable reality of living close to others. Now, picture the ancient city of Pompeii, frozen in time by volcanic ash but alive with stories of everyday life and smell. Before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, Pompeii was a bustling Roman city filled with the sense of Mediterranean life. Narrow streets were alive with vendors selling fresh fish, fruits, bread, and olives. But alongside the delightful smells were the less pleasant realities. Animal waste, sewage, and garbage piled in corners. Many homes had small latrines that emptied directly into street drains, which sometimes overflowed and flooded the roads. The volcanic ash preserved Pompeii's streets and even its smells in a way. Remnants of perfumes, cooking fires, and even urine stains offer archaeologists clues about the city's olfactory environment. Pompeii also teaches us about the relationship between smell and disaster. The sudden eruption sealed the city's fate, but the smells of daily life, both fragrant and foul, were abruptly silenced. This moment of pause in history allows us to understand the full sensory experience of an ancient city in a way few others do. From the scent of fresh-baked bread wafting through the air to the stench of waste in crowded alleys, Pompeii encapsulates the complex dance of smells that defined urban life. It's a poignant reminder that the essence of a city isn't just its buildings or streets. It's the invisible atmosphere we often take for granted. As we continue our journey, let's consider the impact of animals on the ancient city smellscape. Animals were indispensable, yet their presence often contributed to the most stubborn and pervasive odors. Horses, donkeys, cattle, pigs, dogs, and poultry lived alongside humans, sometimes sharing cramped quarters. Streets were often littered with manure and animal waste, which fermented under the sun, releasing ammonia and other pungent compounds. In cities like ancient Athens or Babylon, animals were essential for transport, labor, and food. Their waste wasn't just a nuisance. It was a constant challenge for city sanitation. Sometimes manure was collected for use as fertilizer, but often it simply piled up or was tossed into streets and rivers. The smell of livestock mixed with the scent of urban refuse created a layered olfactory environment that could be overwhelming. Dogs, while valued for protection and companionship, also contributed to the city's aroma with their waste and body odor. In some ancient cultures, animals were also sacred. For example, in Egypt, cats were revered, but their presence in homes and temples added another dimension to the city's smells. Interestingly, ancient laws sometimes regulated animal presence to control smells and disease, forbidding pigs in certain districts or limiting where animals could roam. This reveals a growing awareness of the connection between animal odors, hygiene, and public health. The coexistence of humans and animals in close quarters was a defining feature of ancient urban life, shaping the sensory experience in profound ways. It reminds us that the stench of ancient cities was not just human but a complex mix of all living creatures. Turning to the marketplaces, the beating heart of ancient cities, these were places where smell reigned supreme. Imagine crowded bazaars stretching for miles, teeming with vendors selling everything from spices and textiles to fresh fish and meat. The air was thick with a potent blend of aromas: the sharp tang of citrus, the earthy scent of fresh herbs, the musk of leather goods, and the unmistakable stench of spoiled or rotting produce. Fish markets, in particular, were notorious for their overpowering smell. Fish was a staple in many ancient diets, but without refrigeration, spoilage was rapid. Stalls overflowed with fresh catches alongside piles of discarded guts and scales that were dumped nearby, attracting flies and vermin. Meat markets added their own pungency, with blood and offal spilling onto the ground. Butchers often struggled to keep their areas clean, and the smell could become unbearable. At the same time, the rich variety of spices and perfumes offered a fragrant contrast, creating an intense sensory patchwork. In places like the markets of ancient Cairo or Baghdad, the air was a complex cocktail, simultaneously inviting and repelling. Vendors might use aromatic herbs or incense to mask the worst odors, but these efforts were only partially successful. The market smellscape was a microcosm of the city itself, alive, chaotic, and layered. It reflected the vitality of urban life but also its struggles with decay and disorder. And for many residents, navigating this world of scents was a daily challenge, one that demanded resilience and adaptation. As the sun set over the ancient city, another source of smell came alive: the night markets and taverns, hubs of social life but also potent contributors to the urban scentscape. By day, the streets might be clogged with garbage and the sharp odors of animals, but by night, the air thickened with the smell of fermented drinks, sweat, smoke, and human bodies pressed close together. Taverns were smoky and loud, filled with the aroma of spilled wine, stale beer, and the tang of unwashed skin. In cities like Athens or Carthage, taverns were places where all classes mingled, and the mix of scents reflected this diversity. From the finely perfumed aristocrat to the rough-hewn laborer, the alcohol and smoke could mask or mingle with the less pleasant odors, but they also created their own unique stench. The night air was alive with sound and smell, a chaotic blend that could feel intoxicating or overwhelming. Street performers, vendors, and revelers added to the sensory overload, with perfumes, sweat, and sometimes the stench of vomit or worse. This nocturnal olfactory world reveals the double-edged nature of city life: vitality and decay, pleasure and discomfort intertwined. It also reminds us that smell was not just a passive backdrop but an active player in social interactions and urban culture. One striking example comes from medieval Europe, where the act of fumigation involved burning aromatic herbs or incense around one's body and clothes to cleanse the air, a primitive attempt to erase odor without water. These practices reveal the constant human struggle to balance environment, resources, and dignity. And then there's the smell of firewood and charcoal. Cooking fires burned constantly, filling homes and streets with smoke and soot. Wood smoke carried its own scent, sometimes comforting, sometimes choking. In winter months, the smoke would linger for days, mixing with fog to create a thick, choking haze. The smell was inescapable, a reminder of warmth but also of pollution. This smoke often exacerbated respiratory illnesses, compounding the dangers posed by other urban smells. Imagine breathing all these layers together: sweat, waste, smoke, animals, food, perfume, disease. The ancient city was a complex olfactory battlefield. Yet humans adapted. The resilience to smell is a survival skill. When surrounded by constant odor, the brain filters it out to focus on more immediate threats or pleasures. But that filtering comes with a price, tolerance to what should be intolerable. We might recoil today at the idea of open sewers or garbage-strewn streets, but for ancient city dwellers it was a normal backdrop. This acceptance shaped how cities evolved and how people lived. Some scholars argue that our ancestors' acceptance of urban stench influenced city planning, architecture, and social behavior. Courtyards, open windows, and narrow streets helped channel odors away. Public fountains and baths served as cleansing oases. Cities were living organisms adapting to the constant pressure of smell. In this way, the smellscape of ancient cities was a powerful force, shaping history in invisible but undeniable ways. Let's now explore how religion and spirituality intertwined with the smells of ancient cities. Across cultures, scent was seen as a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Incense burned in temples was not just a pleasant aroma but a symbol of purification, protection, and communication with gods. In ancient Egypt, frankincense and myrrh were prized offerings, their fragrant smoke believed to carry prayers to the heavens. Temples were filled with the thick, sweet haze, masking the less savory smells of large crowds and ritual sacrifices. In Hindu culture, incense remains a vital part of worship. The scent of sandalwood and jasmine purifies the space and the mind, creating an atmosphere conducive to meditation and prayer. But consider the paradox. These religious centers were also hubs of human activity, with crowds, animals, and waste accumulating nearby. The incense was both a spiritual offering and a practical mask. In medieval Christian Europe, church rituals included the swinging of censers releasing aromatic smoke, symbolizing the soul's ascent and divine presence. Monasteries became centers of hygiene and cleanliness, often far cleaner than surrounding cities, partly due to religious prescriptions about purity. Yet even in these sacred spaces, the stench of the city never fully disappeared. The contrast between holy fragrance and urban rot was a constant tension. Another dimension was the association of bad smells with evil or sin. The phrase "smells like sin" wasn't just metaphorical, it reflected a widespread belief that moral corruption had a scent. Witches, heretics, and criminals were often described as smelling foul, a sign of their spiritual decay. This belief influenced social dynamics, where smell became a tool of judgment and exclusion. In ancient Athens, philosophers debated the relationship between the senses and knowledge. Some argued that smell was a lowly sense tied to base instincts, while others saw it as deeply connected to memory and emotion. This ambivalence shows how complex the human relationship with odor has always been. Smell was both intimate and invasive, personal and public. In many ways, it shaped identity. The way someone smelled could mark their class, profession, and even character. Imagine the shame or pride tied to scent in these ancient worlds. And consider how this invisible marker influenced interactions: who was welcomed, who was shunned, who was feared. All of this reminds us that smell in ancient cities was more than nuisance, it was language. It communicated status, health, spirituality, and social order. And the struggle to control it shaped not just daily life but the very soul of the city. Imagine yourself walking through the bustling streets of medieval Paris. The air is thick, not just with the smell of garbage and waste, but also with the cries of merchants, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the chatter of townsfolk. But what really dominates is the oppressive stench that seems to seep into every stone and crevice. Garbage wasn't just an occasional problem, it was a constant. People threw refuse, leftover food, animal bones, broken pottery directly onto the streets or into open pits. There were no organized waste disposal systems. At night, scavengers and animals tore through the piles, scattering filth everywhere. This wasn't merely unpleasant. The rotting heaps attracted rats, which thrived in the filth and multiplied rapidly. The rats carried fleas, tiny, insidious carriers of the bubonic plague. The Great Plague of the 14th century didn't just come from nowhere. It found fertile ground in these smelly, overcrowded cities where sanitation was virtually non-existent. People didn't understand germs, but they felt the connection between filth and sickness. Attempts to clean were sporadic and often ineffective. Ordinances were passed banning waste in the streets, but enforcement was weak. The smell persisted. Some tried to combat it with lime and vinegar, substances believed to neutralize foul odors, and miasmas, the bad air thought to spread disease. But these were only small measures against a massive problem. The plague turned these stinking streets into killing fields. Families vanished overnight, entire neighborhoods emptied. And yet, the city lived on. This horror of smell and disease left a lasting mark on urban planning. Future cities learned to build wider streets, improve drainage, and regulate waste disposal, all in the name of combating the invisible enemy carried on the stench. The story of medieval cities shows us the deadly power of smell not just as discomfort but as a vector of death. But it also shows human resilience and the slow, hard journey towards sanitation and modern urban life. It's a reminder that what we often dismiss as bad smell can have profound consequences. Turning our gaze now to ancient Rome, the city famed for its grandeur but also infamous for its overwhelming odors. Rome was a city of extremes. Marble palaces stood side by side with cramped insulae, multi-story apartment blocks housing the poor. The wealthy bathed in marble tubs perfumed with oils, while the masses shared cramped communal latrines or simply relieved themselves in the streets. The smell of urine was omnipresent. The Romans had a peculiar relationship with it. Urine was actually collected and sold as a valuable commodity used in tanning leather and laundering clothes because of its ammonia content. Public urinals and latrines were common, but sanitation was far from perfect. Waste flowed through open gutters along the streets before reaching the cloaca maxima. During festivals and public events, the stench intensified as crowds overflowed and refuse piled up. The markets, filled with fresh produce, meat, and fish, were both vibrant and pungent. Rotten fruit and spoiled meat quickly contributed to the city's characteristic smell. Even the famed Roman baths, while centers of cleanliness, sometimes gave off a mix of sweat, oils, and dirt as people crowded in. Yet Romans also understood the importance of smell in public life. Perfumes were widely used, and street vendors sold fragrant oils and incense. Writers like Juvenal used the city's smell as a symbol of moral decay, portraying Rome's stench as reflecting its corruption and decadence. But the smell of ancient Rome was more than just a metaphor, it was a physical reality shaping everyday experience. The city's aroma was a blend of life and death, pleasure and disgust.